Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Minister of External Affairs of India. Good afternoon, Dr. S. Jaishankar, Minister for External Affairs of India. Your Excellency, Dr. Shilpak Ambuli, High Commissioner of India to Singapore, Professor Tan Tai Yong, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Xavier, Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS, at the National University of Singapore, I warmly welcome you to today's ISAS Distinguished Lecture titled, Why Bharat Matters, by Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Minister of External Affairs of India. Before we start the proceedings, let me take a few moments to share a little more about our esteemed guest speaker. A diplomat turned politician, Dr. Jaishankar has earned the stature of the most eloquent and sharp defender of Indian Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi's foreign policy. The former Foreign Secretary is the first career diplomat in India to become the country's foreign minister. Handpicked by Prime Minister Modi, Dr. Jaishankar has been the Minister of External Affairs since May 2019. As a diplomat, he has served as India's ambassador to the United States, China, Singapore, and Czech Republic, in addition to the other diplomatic assignments in several other countries. And prior to entering politics, Dr. Jaishankar served as the Global Corporate Affairs President at the Tata Sons Private Limited. Dr. Jaishankar was honored with the prestigious Padma Shri Award by the President of India in 2019. And he received his Master's in Political Science and an MPhil and PhD in International Relations from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor for ISAS to have Minister S. Jaishankar to deliver today's ISAS Distinguished Lecture. Thank you, sir. And it's my pleasure now to invite ISAS Chairman, Professor Tan Tai Yong, to deliver the welcome remarks. Professor Tan, please.
Dr. S. Jaishankar, Minister of External Affairs, India, ISAS Management Board members, Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues. On behalf of ISAS, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's distinguished lecture entitled Why Bharat Matters. We're honored to have Dr. Jaishankar deliver this lecture. India's growth story has drawn global attention, with a growth of 7.2% at a time when the global economic outlook seems rather grim. India has demonstrated impressive resilience, moving from the 8th to the 5th largest economy in the world over the past decade. On the strategic front, there appears to be a shift in India's relations with major powers such as the US, China, and Europe. India has become a more active player in the Indo-Pacific region, engaging through mini-lateral groupings such as the Quad and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. At the bilateral level, India has moved to deepen its ties with key players to include comprehensive strategic partnerships. A number of other free trade agreements have also either been concluded or are currently under negotiation. Apart from this, a recent agreement between ASEAN and India to deepen their existing comprehensive strategic partnership on key issues such as the blue economy, connectivity, and food security shows the interest among the Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore, to work more closely with India. On the international stage, it's widely said that India is now becoming a voice for the global south. During its G20 presidency last year, India strongly pushed for a more sustainable and inclusive agenda, focusing on economic growth, financial stability, and development needs, issues that are of major concern to developing countries. The inclusion of the African Union as a full member of the G20 and separately the expansion of the BRICS also bear testimony to India's commitment to bringing representatives of the global south to the table. We also see that India is now emerging as a prominent voice for new age challenges such as climate change, technology advancement, and world health, among others. However, while India has made impressive economic and strategic progress, there are challenges that lie ahead. The intensification of great power rivalry has transformed the assessment of national security concerns for countries across the world. Global developments such as the growing contestation between China and the US, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and more recently the Israel-Hamas conflict have tested India's ability to tread the diplomatic tightrope. China's growing footprint in India's neighborhood also continues to remain a concern. Today, we live in a world where the after effects of the pandemic and the global supply chain fragmentation have similarly accelerated deglobalization, protectionism, and a struggle for a balance of interests among big and small powers. It has also highlighted the need for economies to de-risk and diversify. In the days to come, India will have to carefully balance its interests and ties to ensure stability and peace, while also maintaining its own economic growth momentum. This afternoon, we are pleased to have Dr. Jaishankar deliver the ISAS Distinguished Lecture. I'm proud to share that ISAS has a deep affiliation with Dr. Jaishankar. He was a distinguished visiting research fellow with us before becoming India's External Affairs Minister. He spent some time at the Institute writing his earlier book. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Jaishankar for recently launching ISAS's latest book, India and the Future of G20 in Delhi. Today, we're delighted to host this distinguished lecture based on Dr. Jaishankar's latest publication, Why Bharat Matters. Like all of you, I look forward to hearing his thoughts on India's progress and achievements and the challenges that lies ahead, especially given the complexities of a more fragmented world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor now to invite the Honorable Minister of External Affairs of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, to deliver the ISAS Distinguished Lecture.
Professor Tanta Yong, Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, distinguished guests, dear friends, I think all of you know I mean it when I say I'm delighted to be back in Singapore. Now, when I look at this extraordinary collection of old friends which I see in the room, I think I should be writing books more often. But it is really, for me, a great pleasure to come here and talk about my second book, the one which I released in January. And Singapore for two reasons. One, what Taeyong mentioned, that I started the daunting task of writing books the first time when I retired from the Foreign Service. And I was with ISAS as a fellow. Once you do something the first time and it doesn't go too badly, you're tempted to do it a second. But also because I do think there are very serious debates today underway in the world. And I can't think of a better location, really, to lay out some of the issues of that debate. So what I'd like to do today is really, in a way, walk you through the book perhaps discuss what my own thought processes were in that exercise, and then hopefully say something sufficiently provocative for all of you to react. So, first of all, why did I write that book? I wrote that book because I wanted to really drive home the message that foreign policy matters in a globalized world. Now, you would say it's very obvious. I mean, it's not a difficult message to give in Singapore. But in many ways, Singapore is an exception, because Singapore, for its own prosperity, for its own progress, since its modern existence, has actually navigated through the currents of international politics very adeptly, judging the temperature, the direction of the wind, the currents. But it's not that obvious when you come from a much larger, more continental society, which by the nature of its own size and history and geography often tends to be less sensitive to the shifts in what is happening in the world. Now, in my book, I actually have a chapter which tries to explain to an average person not involved, not in terms of directly taking interest in day-to-day foreign policy, why foreign policy is important. And it's important because there are the pluses and minuses of the world, the opportunities of the world, the challenges of the world. And particularly in the last 5 years, definitely in the last 10, I think we have, each of us in our own lives, experienced this very graphically. The dominant collective experience, of course, for all of us has been the COVID. And when one thinks about it, my mind goes back to early January of 2020, when we first started reading about the outbreak of COVID. And I don't think any of us could have imagined at that time, how all-consuming it would be, how it would take over our lives, what we would, each one, because I can't imagine there's actually anybody whose life was untouched by the COVID in some form. So the very nature of such a pandemic, now it's not that pandemics have not happened before. Something somewhat similar happened almost exactly a century ago, the Spanish flu. But the intensity of this one, the speed at which it spread, the manner in which it affected its lives was something really very unprecedented. Now, what it also did was, it demonstrated to all of us how much things outside our national boundaries mattered. Because in different ways, we depended on supplies of various kinds from the rest of the world. And when those supplies did not come, they had direct or indirect, immediate or cascading impact on our lives. Now, as I said, the world has the pluses and minuses. On the one hand, the globalization of the world was demonstrated by the manner in which the pandemic itself spread. So too was the fact that we were all so extraordinarily reliant for our daily necessities on one part of the global geography. And when that came under stress or in disruption, we all experienced the consequences to different degrees of severity. But there were other examples of the globalization and why foreign policy matters as well. And I share here an Indian perspective. I mean, we were very major producers of vaccines. I first, as a minister, I was in a group of about 5 ministers whom the Prime Minister had tasked to deal with the COVID. So one part of it was watching this pandemic come towards you, trying to prepare a country in terms of public health capabilities and other responses which were required at that time. But once and then again, trying to go out in the world, get the masks and the PPEs and the ventilators, all of which, the prices were exorbitant at that time. But once we started responding, other aspects of globalization were also visible. And that too told us why foreign policy mattered, which was the producing vaccines itself. We were, in a way, at the end of a complex global supply chain. And every part of that chain, which was really spread across multiple countries, had to work if vaccines were to be delivered. And one of my most memorable, I would say actually honestly stressful memories of that period were going to the US in 2021 with a binder this thick about all the orders that had been placed across the world, but in one way or the other, which went through the US. And until those were cleared, really the global supply chain for vaccine production wouldn't work. And to this day, I remember with very deep appreciation, deep gratitude, the fact that my counterpart, Tony Blinken, actually intervened to override what was at that time the decision of the administration to invoke certain laws which were a barrier for the supply chain to work. Now, we saw this go up and down. We had, when the Delta variant came, we had a huge oxygen problem. And we sourced oxygen from across the world. And many countries, including Singapore, went out of the way to find some way of shipping oxygen across to India. Similarly, when it came to vaccines themselves, there was an international initiative, but we also felt a lot of countries might take them too long to get their turn on that. In many cases, we supplied through the initiative or directly, and actually 99 countries of the world in one way or the other got their vaccines from India. So I mentioned the COVID because I will come back to that subject again, because perhaps nothing more impactful has happened in the last few years that would remind us of what both the challenges, I would say sometimes the dangers, as well as the importance of cooperation in responding to it. That what is it we need to do to deal with it. If I can give you a completely different example, I go to another factor which reminds us why foreign policy matters. And that is the impact today of conflict on our lives, on our daily lives. Now, there was a time when conflicts could happen. It could happen somewhere else, and we are in a different part of the world, and its impact on us. Yes, we read about it in the newspaper, we saw it on the television, and probably it stopped there. It may have had some consequences maybe on the markets. But if one looks today, whether it is the conflict in Ukraine or what is today happening in the Red Sea, we are seeing actually what is an actual or potential or an averted major disruption of our daily routine and actually of our way of living. In our case, as a major energy importer, when the Ukraine conflict started, we saw the price of energy, price of oil virtually double in that period. Even when it settled down finally, it was about 50% higher than what it was before the conflict started. Now, how, considering today that I represent a society where our per capita income is less than $3,000 per annum, for us to take a hit on energy prices with all its inflationary consequences would have been extremely hurtful. So here foreign policy serves as an example of where a certain judgment, a certain resolve is able to serve national interest is actually, in a way, it protected the Indian consumer from what would have been otherwise a very unnecessary rise in energy prices. Or let me shift to something much broader than a particular conflict. If one looks today at the nature of the workplace, that too has changed. The workplaces have got increasingly global, and we have today the reality of vast number of people who temporarily, a little bit more, less so, go out in search of their livelihood. And we realized that, it was brought home to us again when COVID happened, because you had, people working in the hotel industry, the airline industry, the cruise liner industry, the maritime shipping, students whose dormitories were closing, tourists who were stranded abroad, business people who went out, didn't have flights to come back. And in fact, when we launched a mission to get back to people to India, it was called Vande Bharat Mission. The first set of people who were, I would say, the immediately impacted people were as high as 7 million people. And bringing back 7 million people in a matter of a few months was, in many ways, probably the largest evacuation that has ever happened in history. And I mentioned that to you, not because of the magnitude of what we did, but as a reminder today, how much actually people are spread out across the world, and therefore what are the responsibilities of a government that come with it, and why it is important for people to understand foreign policy, because as they go out in the world, they too have to do a risk assessment about where they go, when they go, how they go, and these too are factors today. So overall, in terms of foreign policy in a globalized world, I would say that it is today shaping the global landscape. Actually getting it right is very much today the flip side of national development and progress. That we can't say this is inside, that is outside, I only do this, what is inside my country, it's not my business to know what is happening outside. The two are today very, very closely intermeshed. In a way, they have always been. I mean, at least for many decades now, all countries, whether it is the quest for capital or for technology or for best practices, or I would say even for economic market access or for connectivity, yes, we interact with the world, we make it very much part of our economic, even social thinking. But the process today has got so much more intense, so much more interpenetrative, and so much more pervasive that the idea that we can divide the world inside, outside is something that we need to grow out of. So that, in many ways, was a central message of my book. Now, flowing from that, of course, is that if the world is so important, it's equally important to understand this world. And to understand this world, we have to grasp the 5 big phenomena of our times: globalization, rebalancing, which is in a way, I would say the relative weight of countries, regions is shifting, changing. Multipolarity, where rebalancing reaches a point where actually today you have countries or groups who have a certain determining role or an influential role. The impact of technology, which is far deeper than it has ever been before. And of course, finally, the competitive nature of world politics, of international relations, which has always been there. But with these 5 factors in mind, I think today's world also has some very distinguishing characteristics of our era, you might say. And it is important to understand that if one has to navigate the world, if one has to assess what are the opportunities, if one has to understand what are the risks. And I picked 6 or 7 of them, which I believe are very critical for all of us. And I highlight them in a way as challenges, but every challenge then has a basis for countries working together as a possibility to cooperate. Now, the first characteristic I would say is actually the weaponization of almost everything. Today, whether it is trade, it's investment, it is tourism, it is currency, it is a digital transaction, it is a physical movement, there is nothing that cannot be and that has not been weaponized. So the idea that we do things for our prosperity and good, and that's where the buck stops, that idea too is behind us. Almost everything in some way or the other is an exposure of some kind, could be in the wrong circumstances, a vulnerability of some kind. And therefore, it is important, certainly for major economies, to be more self-reliant, I'll come to that, and for many others to actually effectively and adequately hedge. So how do we deal with this world where any manner of activity and transaction can be used as a point of pressure? The second is that national boundaries matter less and less. National boundaries matter less and less, not in a formal sovereignty way, but in terms of the fact that very often influences and I would say agendas are able to penetrate that very, very effectively. So I have tried to address that in a chapter which is called Reimagining Security. That today a person doesn't have to go to some bad place to get radicalized. Radicalization can come to a very nice home without anybody else, even in that same home, actually knowing what is happening. Or the fact that, information, this is an era of AI and of deep fakes, but it is also an era where, political correctness and global agendas try to shape what is happening in different societies, try to influence on a mass basis the choices of nations. And a lot of it comes from this interpenetration of technology. The third characteristic, of course, which has been building up over the last 25 years is that of over-concentration. Over-concentration of production, over-concentration of technologies. And it's a simple risk analysis. If in the world, a very large proportion is dependent on a single source, it doesn't have to be even international relations. None of us running an enterprise would ever take that risk. And yet we, as the world, have actually ended up there. That we have ended up, and this was brought home, perhaps this was one of the strongest lessons of the COVID. That, why was it that for something as basic as masks, as PPEs, as ventilators, none of which was rocket science, why was it that the rest of the world was struggling? Why was it that for very basic medicines, the APIs, the bulk drugs, we were worrying about disruption of one area? So how does one today deal with this challenge of over-concentration? I would say, because the tendency is to deal with it as a political choice. But this is actually an issue for the economic well-being of the world. That you are actually, you're not de-risking a country, you're actually de-risking the global economy. So that to me would be the third characteristic. Now these have two consequences. One, when it comes to supply chains, where it is important to have more reliable, more resilient, more redundant supply chains. When it comes to digital, I think we have a challenge of a very different order, which is the whole sensitivity about data, about who collects the data, who processes the data, who deploys the data, who monetizes the data. So the whole issue of trust and transparency in the digital field, and of resilience and reliability when it comes to supply chains. Now, all this, I mean, because this was, in a way, the invitation which Professor Tantayong gave me, which is, what is the re-globalization that we are looking about? Re-globalization today is the challenge of a much broader production, of many more supply chains, of dealing with digital challenges in a way in which we are comfortable where trust and transparency is concerned. And what it has done is that it has actually, I'm good. What it has done is that it has actually created today a push for strategic autonomy in different parts of the world. Now, in India, we used to speak about strategic autonomy in the 1990s, maybe the early 2000s. For us, in our lexicon at that time, this largely had to do with protecting our nuclear option. And to some extent, I would say people thought of it in terms of getting into, alliance arrangements or coming under alliance pressures. Today, people think of strategic autonomy in a very different way. If we go to Europe today, there's a big push in Europe saying, we have allowed too much of our manufacturing to go out. This is even sharper in the United States. In the Gulf, strategic autonomy means, do we have enough assured supply chains where food security is concerned? Because that was a very big worry for the Gulf during the COVID. So across the world today, what our experiences of the last 5 years have done is they made us much more insecure, much more conscious of our vulnerabilities, much more concerned about how we could be securing ourselves in difficult situations. And different countries have moved about it in their particular way. Now, where India is concerned, many of these anxieties and drivers were already there. We have, therefore, a quest towards what we call Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is like a self-reliant India. But the idea really is that there should be much more which is made in India, and much more which in different areas, including energy resources, natural resources, where you have assured access to what are your critical needs. Now, apart from all these characteristics, of course, there is one other characteristic, which is the big power competition. I refer here specifically to US and China. And when I was writing my first book, people still thought of this as something tactical. They associated it with a particular administration and a particular president in the United States. If we today move up 4 years, I think most people today would accept that this is increasingly structured, that this is something which is going to be multi-administration, that this is going to be hardwired into the policies of certainly the two main countries concerned, but in different ways it is something which all of us have to think about in a much more permanent way. Now, having described the world, how does India cope with it? Through a variety of responses, and I've again in the book tried to, as someone inside the room, and again, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, which is I wanted to share, to make people understand, okay, what has changed and why has it changed? And actually, it's the people inside the room who can give you the best answer. I mean, it may be subjective, but nevertheless, it is an informed answer which certainly should be available to the public. So how does India cope? One, of course, by having a foreign policy which is multi-vector. That multi-vector means the ability to engage all the major players in as effective and positive a manner as possible. Secondly, by reimagining and reworking the immediate neighborhood, which is why we have pushed this outlook of what we call neighborhood first. Neighborhood first meaning as the biggest country of the Indian subcontinent, deal with our neighbors in a more generous, in a more non-reciprocal way, thinking much more long-term, insulating the relationship from the ups and downs of the politics, which in democratic societies will naturally keep changing. Then to look beyond the immediate vicinity towards what I describe as the extended neighborhood. Extended neighborhood starting, of course, first of all with ASEAN, Southeast Asia, then with the Gulf, and southwards what we have a policy called Sagar, which means ocean, towards the island states, and finally towards Central Asia. So, I mean, it looks conceptually very neat and clear, so you go in 4 directions. But if you look at the common, what is common to the 4 policies, it is each of these regions actually has a historical connect with India, that there is dormant or less dormant history here waiting to be tapped. As the economy becomes bigger, as other factors come into play, each of these regions is very fertile ground for closer engagement. And my assertion in the book is a big part of the transformation of Indian foreign policy, other than the multi-vector direction, has been actually this very intensive cultivation of the immediate neighborhood and then the 4 extended neighborhood movement. Now, having said that, there is also the world beyond. And for much of the world beyond, what is happening in India, with India, is of immense interest. And that is where the Global South comes in, because the Global South in many ways is a larger constituency, which is bound to us through historical experiences. They are all post-colonial societies, but which also share a development situation, that what happens in India in terms of income, in terms of the relevance of that particular development, is actually something that they appreciate. So if you were to look at, let us say, digital, anything digital which happens in India is immediately translatable to the rest of the Global South in terms of what they could do of a similar nature. And the reason why I put it to you in this schema, of course, is that eventually today, and India, which is the 5th biggest economy in the world, which hopes to become the 3rd by overtaking Japan and Germany in the coming years, has to start preparing for a global footprint. And therefore, beyond the region, beyond the extended region, beyond even the solidarity of the Global South, today we have to think from Pacific Islands to Latin America to the Caribbean and start making the most, because these are not developments which can happen at great speed. They will need to be seeded, they will need to be nurtured, they will need to be tended over a period of time. I will mention, in a sense, the thinking finally in my conclusion. And I have focused on 2-3 specific issues, our relationship with China, because I believe that will be very central to our prospects, to their prospects, and to the world. I have spent some time explaining the Quad, because I've had the very unique privilege of being associated with every stage of the Quad, including the first time when it didn't work. So from the time it didn't work to the time it did, and then how it sort of went up in terms of stature and substance. And of course, I particularly focused on a few key partners, because I felt I had not given them their due in my earlier book, which was Russia, which was France, and the United Kingdom. And then I have tried to round it off with a linkage of what is happening at home, because setting our house in order at home, setting our house in economic order, setting our house in political order, is also essential for the rise of a power. So let me conclude by conveying to you, in a way, what does all this mean to you? which is, the title of the book, Why Bharat Matters. And that's a sort of nice way of saying that will be more in your life than before. Now, why would we be more in your life? One, of course, because frankly, we're going to be a much bigger economy. I think today the improved ease of doing business, the ease of living, the infrastructure Gati Shakti program, the digital advances we made. There's today a momentum in India which has to be experienced to be believed. Often I'm asked to convey that sense of change in a shorthand. And the one, some of you may have heard me say this before, so please forgive the repetition if you have, that today this is a country which builds 8 new airports a year, which builds 1.5 new metros, 1.5 new cities of metro every year, which builds 28 kilometers of highway every day, and which for the last 10 years has built 2 colleges a day. So I'm giving you these 4 figures really to convey to you, whether it is the soft side, it's the HR side, it's the physical side, it is the traditional road movement, and I could give you other figures to kind of drive home that message of change. Now, it's not just a growth number or the physical assets. If you actually look at India, it's very interesting. Take 4 representative aspects of Indian society. Okay, politics, cricket. Okay, not necessarily in that order. Business and bureaucracy. I think if any of you are familiar with any of the 4, you would see today they have become far, far more representative than they were 20 or 30 years ago. That if you look at the origins of, people in any of this, that you have in business companies which have literally come out of nowhere. And when you actually track them down, they are from a 3rd level, 4th level town of India, and which would be in the top 10 in a particular field. If you look at, most of my colleagues in parliament, they are far more diverse. I mean, I've watched the parliament from gallery for 45 years. So they are, in a way, it's very interesting. You can actually see over 75 years, that democracy has struck very deep roots. It has transformed much more of the society than even the society consciously is aware. And the result today is actually something very different. Now, and that difference shows up in many, many ways. I mean, if one visits, I visit a lot of educational institutions in India, and I tell people, I remember, maybe not when I was in college, but let's say a few years after that. I mean, typically you would trot out somebody who's done well, this is the gold medalist of the cohort. Today, when you go to a lot of institutions, they tell you, please give us 1 hour. Our students want to do an exhibition, and we want you to meet 5 people who actually hold patents from our university. So you can, this whole startup culture, the innovation, when you look even at who do young people admire today, the unicorns of India are for young people a very, very commonly recognizable name. And that's a very powerful change, which is happening. Now, the country is changing, but naturally the impact of the country in the rest of the world will also accordingly shift. And you can see that. I mean, you can see that, as I said, when it comes to a Quad or the Middle East Corridor, IMEC that we have announced, or the I2U2 grouping that we have done, or the India-Pacific Economic Forum. So there's much more that India is getting into, that India is involved in, that India is trying to shape, lead, push in different ways. Interestingly, at a time when much of the world is actually withdrawing inwards, particularly big countries, India is actually also taking on more responsibilities. So if you look today as India as a first responder, an earthquake somewhere, a cyclone somewhere, a mudslide, I mean, we've actually, it's very interesting. I was for a particular report cataloging, my own tenure as a minister and as foreign secretary. And almost every year we have done one major operation somewhere, an operation which is where we have responded to what is a natural disaster or a man-made disaster in some other part of the world. We have to the economic side of it, and I again, as a conscious of the fact that we missed the manufacturing bus in the previous decades today, I can say that there's a degree of purpose and seriousness and investment today in manufacturing that we have not seen for a long time. One part of it, of course, is symbolized by what's called the PLI scheme, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. And we've seen, a very good global manufacturing response to that. But across the country today, and clearly with better logistics and better talent, you can actually see that the manufacturing message is being taken. And I would stress new manufacturing. A very interesting example is semiconductors, where we have just signed our first fab agreement. We've, I think, had 3 ATMP agreements so far, 2 of them already in the making. We have started to get machinery for semiconductors today to start to be built in India. And where the government is concerned, we have entered into understanding with 104 universities of India, so that they train, they modernize or tweak their engineering courses in a way in which the resources for the semiconductor industry would start to flow. And we all know today that HR, the human resources, is something which is a very, very big constraint on that industry. Right now, we are actually looking at a plan which would give us in the coming years at least 85,000 new people in the semiconductor zone, but it's something which we expect to see grow. So the point I wish to make is that this is very much today a society which will matter more and more by its weight, by its influence, by its contribution, by its responsibility to the rest of the world. We've had a solid decade to build a foundation. I think now we are looking at a quarter of a century ahead, that many of the goals, and even that in I'm sure those of you who are very familiar with India would agree, that it's not always been the case that India has set 25-year goals for itself. That is something which is happening. I mean, there's a 2030 goal, and there's a 2040 goal, and there's a 2047 goal. And the reason, as I said at the end of it all, within my own country, I would like people to get more invested in all these changes, preparing themselves for what is to come. And to the extent this communication helps with the rest of the world, I hope it also explains what is changing as we speak. And I have, of course, this honestly is much more for communication at home. I have used one of our epics as a lens through which I've tried to explain many of these changes. And I must tell you, my reader feedback has been very positive there. A lot of people have got the point very effectively. So these are some of the thoughts I took the liberty of sharing with you. Once again, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be very, very happy to respond to any comments, suggestions, advice that you may have.
Thank you, Minister Sir. May I now invite ISAS Director, Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Xavier on stage to chair the interactive session, please. Thank you, Dr. Sylvia.
Thank you, Dr. Jaishankar, for that engaging and thought-provoking lecture. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions in the audience, but as the moderator, I'm going to make use of my position to just ask 1.5 questions. And I'll be very brief, and hopefully me being brief sets an example for the audience to be brief as well, because I know we're all here to listen to Dr. Jaishankar rather than ourselves. With all due respect. I just like to draw you a little more on the entire context in which this book is framed. The book is responding to broader geo-economic and geopolitical shifts in the geopolitical and geo-economic scenarios and the deep transformations that are going on and the questions that have been raised. And two aspects to this are, one, the crisis of multilateralism that everybody is talking about and is concerned by, and the other is the redistribution of power in the global order. And I'll just like to hear your thoughts on what needs to be done in the multilateral space to reform multilateralism, to save multilateralism, and the role India is poised to play in this. And secondly, the role that India is poised to play in the multipolar world that we are advancing towards. So your thoughts, please.
You know, I spoke about, in a way, globalization, rebalancing, multipolarity. And the thrust of what I was saying was that the world is profoundly different from what it was 80 years ago. And perhaps the most obvious difference is the number of countries in the world. I mean, they have quadrupled in terms of independent countries, sovereign states have quadrupled in this period. So a big challenge for all of us is really, how does the world structures reflect the world reality? Now, this is happening on a world scale. It happens in different countries in terms of the politics and social changes as well. And we are struggling. We are struggling because there is enormous pressure to change. There is very determined resistance to change. And so we've been having these sort of Groundhog Day-like debates, which are circular, where every year you start at the same point and you end up at the same point and you do it as a ritual. So we are now trying to break out of it. I think there's been some improvement in the way in which actually the UN, there's something called the intergovernmental negotiations on this. So people, now they are actually discussing what are the possible models which could be acceptable. There will be debate and discussion, but the longer we put it off, the reality is different countries will go and find their own solutions and do their own things. So you will have more of these minilateral, plurilateral, call it what you will, like-minded groups in different areas. So what that would lead to is a kind of a fracturing of the system, a very uneven performance. There'll be areas where a lot of people pay attention. There'll be areas where, frankly, nobody would care. And it'll be a much messier world. Your second question, the redistribution of power. That's happening. It's happening in very, very interesting ways. I mean, it's happening. Even the G7 to the G20 was one example of it. The fact that you have a group like Quad is another example of it. That the logic of something like Quad is that you have 4 countries who are in different parts of the Indo-Pacific, but who have a convergence, who have a common interest in various aspects of the Indo-Pacific. Or the other example I gave to the West, which is the idea that a few countries get together and say, okay, let's make this big push to build a new connectivity corridor through the Middle East. So And you know, that's one. We in fact have something similar, or not similar is not the right word, but something in parallel going on with what is called the International North-South Transport Corridor, which predates the Middle East Corridor. So it's going to be a very, I would say, a very indisciplined, episodic, unpredictable transition that we are going to see. The transition is not going to be smooth because the pressure for change and the opposition to change are already colliding. It'll also be visible in more and more global solutions, regional solutions, that the era where one country, the US in this case, could be expected to invest in solving many of the world's problems. I think we have to today be realistic about expectations of the United States. There are many things the United States is not going to do. And if somebody else doesn't do it, it just means it doesn't get done.
The floor is open now for questions. We have, I see hands going up. And could I invite the 4 hands that have gone up? There are 4 mics, so if you could make your way to the mic, and then I'll take questions as I see you standing at the mic. Again, please do keep your questions short. So,
yes,
please go ahead. And could you please briefly introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. I'm a 20-year-old undergraduate here at the National University of Singapore. I was fortunate to get a full scholarship from the government of Singapore. So my question to you is, generally as students, we're very optimistic about the India story, not just here, but even in the West. But until we graduate or until we are here, we as international students and strategic partners like Singapore, how do we contribute to India's objectives in a way that benefits not just India, but in this case, Singapore as well?
Thank you, Iqbal. This is Ravi Velood, Straits Times. Yeah. Dr. Jaishankar, you know, in your preface to the book, you have this line saying that when you met Prime Minister Modi for the first time, then Chief Minister, you say that it was apparent to me even then that he envisaged developments in both India and China in terms of civilizational resurgence. Now, last week, I watched you talking to Zaka Jacob, and you sounded decidedly downbeat on the civilizational relationship. You know, particularly, you picked up the phrase Chindia. Now, there have been recent reports of India moving a whole division from the Pakistan border to the central sector, to the middle sector. Now, normally one would have thought that the most problematic sectors were the Arunachal one and the Ladakh on the west. But it's particularly worrying when one hears of a division strength being moved to the middle sector. So is that relationship going nowhere? Where do you see it?
We'll take one more question.
I could take 2 more since both of them are saying.
Good afternoon. I'm Preeti Davra. I work in the President's Office at Nanyang Technological University. Last year, we had done the Singapore India Hackathon in IIT Gandhinagar at the request of Prime Minister Modi. And it was a transformative experience for so many of the Singapore students and startups who participated and traveled to India. Could you explain to us, why does it matter for Singapore, ASEAN, and other extended neighborhood countries to engage on technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship with India? What are you unleashing over there that is now suddenly put this India on a momentous scale to tap into that potential that India always had?
My name is Bharat Manloy. I have 2 questions which are not so profound, so they're very straightforward. The first is, being the External Affairs Minister of India, but more personally, what do you think is a possible roadmap for improving relations with two of our neighbors, Pakistan and China. And you don't have to be politically correct, I presume here. Number two is, I'm a OCI. I would like to know, do I get to see a dual citizenship in India at some point? Thank you.
So we'll take these questions. We'll take this. Could you just?
May I ask? If you don't mind, let me reply to these questions. Then I'll come back for a second round. Let me start with the young gentleman. You know, in a way, your question and Preeti's question are kind of linked. Now, you know, what is it you can contribute? Look, I mean, first of all, you know, when you come out as an international student studying out here, that itself is something of considerable value you're doing, because you are becoming a kind of a bridge, someone who's lived here who can explain things back there, someone come from there who can explain things here. But what we are today seeing among young people in different domains is an enormous enthusiasm today to find their own solutions, to experiment, and it's really, you know, something which is so striking that, you know, as I was giving you the example that if you go to a college today, they say, okay, a person has a patent. I went some months ago, this was after our lunar, the Chandrayaan landing, okay? I went to this institute in Thiruvananthapuram, where they actually educate people in space technology. And I found, you know, students there who still doing their degrees, who had in some form actually contributed something by the way of a technology or a invention or a contraption which had been used by some mission somewhere. You know, and when I looked at the kind of facilities today that they have, the manner in which they are putting it to use, I mean, I spoke, you know, of this effort which we are going to start on, of which started already in a way on the semiconductor field. I mean, it isn't just that we are asking 104 universities saying, please change your curriculum. We are actually giving them today access to equipment and to technologies which will give them a hands-on sense today about what is happening. So, Preeti, the answer why, you know, for example, our hackathons important. One, we ourselves have found so many solutions today, you know, day-to-day issues or long-tending practices, and each of these, in a way, you know, is like an education. You know, one of the nice things of being a minister is you sit in on gatherings and groupings where people are discussing something other than your own direct business. So you are actually learning many more things which you would not if you are looking at it in a much more departmental way. So when today I hear about, say, how do we train drone operators for use of nano fertilizers? Now, you look at the levels of change here that we are talking about. So a lot of what you see today, you know, in fintech, for example, a lot of this coming out of very young people. So the idea is this old mindset that there are certain subjects, the government will be a big employer. If it is not the government, it will be a big company. We want people actually to be much more self-employed, much more the startup culture, employ other people of, you know, their peer group. So you are actually trying to change the entrepreneurial technology culture of the entire country. And that is why these are both, you know, valuable experiences, but the messaging from that as an inspiration for everybody else is very, very powerful. On Ravi's set of questions, okay, because the civilizational, the downbeat, the Chindia, the 10,000, the alleged 10,000 troops for the supposed middle sector. There are times when we have better things to do than to deny what people might float. Here's the point. Look, why I referred to it in my book was, I mean, just some of you may have read the book, some of you may have not. So very quickly as a recap, I write there that I first met Prime Minister Modi when I was ambassador in China. And I've described that very briefly. Now, the fact is that he, and today I think the country, sees the rise of India in civilizational terms. Now we recognize today that that is also the case with the rise of China. So the challenge for me is how do we find a sustainable equilibrium today between the two rising powers who also happen to be neighbors and who have a history and a population which sets them apart from the rest of the world, and who have also capabilities which, with the passage of time, could also set them apart from the rest of the world. So this is a very, very complex challenge. Now, the starting point for this obviously would be if we are trying to do something difficult, at least the parts that were worked out, keep them going. Keep it steady, build on it. So it came as a great surprise to us when the Chinese in 2020 chose to do something on the border which was completely violative of agreements we had reached. So instead of actually solidifying the foundation for an equilibrium, they went and disturbed the foundation. So the big issue for us today, from time to time, we hear this that the boundary solution can take its time. We don't argue with that. It could. It's a very complex issue. We're not talking of solving the boundary dispute. We are talking about maintaining peace and tranquility on the border. And we had. I mean, from 1975 till 2020, nobody got killed on that border. So for 45 years, it worked. We have to ask ourselves today, why is it not working now? And until we have that stabilization of the border, to me, it is illogical to expect that the equilibrium building, the relationship building, doing more things would move forward. Because it will naturally engender enormous distrust if you didn't keep your part of the bargain, particularly if there's already a prior history of this continuing. So that's really the issue. Here I think it's important really not to lose the woods for the trees. I mean, there might be a report here or not, which may be true or not. I think no sensible government confirms troop movements, least of all to someone from a foreign newspaper. But that said, we are today trying to find a way out, and it's not easy. I mean, I have myself invested a great deal of effort with my counterpart, and at the military commanders level, at the diplomatic level, we've had 20 plus rounds of talks. In a way that answers the next question, what is your policy towards Pakistan and China? The China part I have answered. The Pakistan part, look, every country wants a stable neighborhood. It's logical, If you are a person living on a street, you want good neighbors. If nothing else, you want at least a quiet neighborhood. Now, we have been, what shall I say, unfortunate or ill-starred, or so to be blessed with the one that we have to our west. Now, here's a very, basic problem. How do you deal with a neighbor who does not hide the fact that they use terrorism as an instrument of statecraft? Now, it's not a one-off happening. I mean, different countries at different points of time have experienced this. But a very sustained, almost an industry level, assembly line of people whose job it is to do bad things at night. To produce this with the intent of pressurizing your neighbor becomes a real challenge. So what we have come to conclude is that we have to find a way of addressing it, that dodging the problem gets us nowhere. It only invites more trouble. So I don't have a quick instantaneous fix. But what I can tell you is that India will not skirt this problem anymore. We are not going to say, well, that happened and let's continue our dialogue because that's very important. I think if we have a problem, we must be honest enough to face up to that problem, however difficult it is. If we have to have those discussions, we should. And if it is, hard to find a solution, we must work through to the way. We should not give the other country a free pass saying there's nothing they can do about it, or it's a very hard problem, or there's so much else at stake that let us overlook it. In India, the mood is not to overlook terrorism. I would say if you look in a way of what are the changes in India which have happened in the last decade plus, a great deal of public anger about a lack of response to terrorism threat has been one factor about the perceptions in politics. So it is a tough one, but it is something on which we will stay the course. Dual citizenship. On dual citizenship, honest answer, we have, at the moment, this was, the OCI was something which was decided upon, I think, during Atalji's time. So it's about 20 years old. We've had, people give us ideas and so on, but I'm not aware of any specific discussion saying, okay, beyond that, what do we do? I mean, I think people are still mulling it over and talking it over. I mean, that's the state of play.
We'll go for another round of questions. There was a gentleman who was standing up earlier, so we'll start with him, and then we'll go to you, and then...
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Mano. So, I'm a Singaporean editor and writer. Two questions for you. One is actually, you touched on that, the China-India relationship. There's a lot of water under the bridge. My question is, do you think Singapore being close friends with both China long-term relationship and India as well, and our population has also got majority Chinese with a good Indian minority. I mean, can Singapore play a role, you think, in sort of gradual, improvement of relations between India and China, better understanding, so on? That's one. My second question is, again, India's deep relationship with Russia, previously Soviet Union, now Russia. And however, I think that, I see India also getting closer to the US in some ways. I mean, in the news yesterday just was about, for example, the PRC claiming almost a whole state of India, Arunachal, and the US stood up to say they recognize the border between India and China on that front. In India is like, and you touched on all the startups and the unicorns in India. I think India is a young America in terms of your politics, in terms of your DNA. It's like America was 50 years, maybe 100 years ago, where they were starting to invent a lot of new things and pushing forward. So on that point, do you see India in a mega trend moving closer to the US? Or will it stay, or will there be some kind of balance? Thank you.
We'll just go to the gentleman over there at the back.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon, Dr. Jayashankar. My name is Karthik Kadampulli. I've been a tech entrepreneur for over 20 years based out of India with global operations, and currently based out of Bangalore running a virtual accelerator. Now, through all of this, what we had seen, not just in the last couple of decades, but for centuries, the Indian image externally is defined by the narrative that comes from outside, and we are subject to that. It's heartening to see that, it's very pleasant to see that there is a big change India is not docile anymore. The messaging is a little assertive. But then the bombardment of narratives are so intense that it's very difficult to find what is right, what is wrong from an external point of view. Internally, it's different. When we travel in India, it's different. My wife Archana and I, we travel a lot outside. The question thereby is, what's the plan? What's the strategy that Indian government has to kill this narrative and state what India is and is doing? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Jayashankar. I'm Anushri, a 21-year-old undergraduate student in Nanyang Technological University. So I'm going to try to phrase this as well as I can. And so we're youngsters who have access to various kinds of media that at a pace and intensity that is unimaginable and often leads to, I mean, similar to the previous question, but leads to misinformed and not so factually grounded opinions. So how do we as young Indians educate ourselves and encourage our peers to objectively see a changing India at a domestic and global level outside of the political and ideological divides? Yeah.
We'll take one more question from the gentleman.
Yes. Dr. Jayashankar, my name is Kasi. A little away from India, but I wanted to check, as a diplomat, more than even an external affairs minister, what is your reading of the situation in Israel and the Palestine situation? Because India is friendly on both sides with the Arabs and the Israelis. And how does India or you visualize the situation gradually in the next couple of years, or what is the solution in the long term?
Okay, can we stop there? Then we can. Well, the first question, I've heard many people use many terms for India, but the first time I've heard India is described as a young America. And I honestly don't know what to make of that. Can Singapore play a role on India-China? In world politics, sometimes you have countries who have helped carry messages. So if two countries are not dealing with each other, to deal through a third country. We don't have any of those problems with China. I'm in touch with my counterpart. The embassies work in both countries, diplomacy works, the military commanders deal with each other. And the issue is not really about miscommunication. I mean, I assure you, their English is wonderful, and our Chinese is even better. If any of you, any of you doubt me, please try your luck with the High Commissioner. So look, the issue today, the issue for us today is not of communication, misunderstanding. It is really today of decisions and choices and policies which countries have made. And if somewhere there is the resulting situation is one which has become a big problem, then I think it behoves both of them to sit down and sort it out. So for us, we're not asking for the moon. I mean, what we are saying is, listen, we have agreements. We had an agreement of 93, 96, 2005, 2011, 2012. We have these written agreements. Both of us signed up to it. It's been working all the way till 2020. So why don't we sit down and sort it out and, figure out how we continue that peace and tranquility which we maintained for so long. On Russia, US, you see, these are, when I said multi-vector policy, today this is something which certainly every significant country is going to face, which is, if you have conflicting interests, if you have different partners, if you are vested in relationships which are often appear to be at cross purposes with each other. How do you actually reconcile this? The answer is clearly to find ways by which each one of them is dealt with on a non-exclusive basis. In fact, when I come to Israel-Palestine, I will take that same logic into that. So it will be for us, how do we today deal with good relations with Russia, good relations with Europe, or good relations with US, good relations with some other country? I mean, this is a way which, today's diplomacy is going to require us to do. Some of us will do it a little bit more successfully, some of us less so. Countries which have strong alliance cultures don't have that dilemma because they've already, in a sense, made their choice. They've signed up to a larger group think on a particular issue. Countries which are not part of an alliance will have to think this through for themselves. And India is clearly in that category. The other two questions are somewhat similar, which is, there is an external narrative, you're bombarded with it. The other question was, how do we educate people to think objectively about India? So here's my point, and I've actually, again, written about it in the book itself. This is not an accident. If people are saying unflattering things, it could be due to ignorance, but it could equally be due to an intent or an agenda or a competition or some game plan. And when we speak today about how the world is changing, what happened first? What happened was, as countries became free in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and you immediately saw the newly independent countries, many of them, not all of them, become a much better economic production centers. ASEAN itself is a very good example. And therefore, increasingly significant consumption centers. So over a period of time, you actually had economic rebalancing. So when we speak about the tiger economies, for example, this is part of the economic rebalancing which happened once many more countries were allowed to make their own choices. Now, at some stage, the economic rebalancing built up to a level where these countries said, but we also have political views. We want a say in how big decisions are taken. And we saw that during the global financial crisis, that the G7 was not able to handle the global financial crisis all by itself. And so we actually ended up with a G20. And if you see in the 15 years that have passed, 16 years that have passed, the G20 has actually continuously expanded its agenda. That what it began doing and what it does today is far more. Now we come to the next stage. And the next stage is actually a cultural rebalancing, which is what is right, what is wrong, what is a value, who gets to pass judgment on whom. These are all going to be contested. And in many ways here, the dominant force has been the West. And the West has maintained that ability to actually become, it's a kind of both a player and an umpire at the same time. And mostly they win as a result. So what happens today is people have to contest that. Others have to come on the field and say, no, I don't accept that judgment. And when you start diverging, and by the way, this is an industry in itself, how to make rankings, how to give reports, how to use media. I mean, if you look at how the Western media actually shapes the reputation of countries, the perception of countries, it's a very powerful tool that they have. So answer is in each one of these to push back, to put alternatives, to find different ways of placing that narrative. And now there are, fortunately, technology offers more solutions. So if somebody controls many of the newspapers, you have a social media option. If somebody is making a ranking, it's possible others will now start making their own ranking. So these will be actually the coming, I would say, features of the pushback or of the cultural side of the rebalancing, the narrative side of the rebalancing, which I can see happening. Finally, on the Israel, our position here, because that's in a way an answer. We are very, very clear that what happened on October 7th was terrorism. Okay, cannot be any defense of it. There cannot be any caveats to it. I think we need to call that out, which we did very unambiguously. Now, in terms of how the Israelis are responding, we've also taken the view that in any response, the care has to be taken about civilian casualties. International humanitarian law needs to be observed. And we are at a situation today where clearly the need is to find a way of delivering humanitarian aid to a civilian population on a sustainable basis. But beyond that, I think there is a longer-term issue, really, which is some of these may answers for this problem, but what do you do on a more permanent basis? And we are very clear that we have to find a two-state solution. And it's not something, we don't say different things in Israel and different things in Palestine. When I spoke about managing relationships, we have no hesitation in saying that publicly. So we deal with the Palestinians. We've actually stepped up our assistance in the last many years to Palestine. We do projects with the Palestinian Authority. So there is that, there is this. We have to find a way in which the two can be reconciled. We understand it is not very easy. Right now, there are very serious efforts underway, some of which I cannot speak about publicly. And we are very, very supportive of the efforts of a few countries who are working right now to find a way out of the present situation.
As the moderator, I have the very unpopular job of warning everybody that we have to wrap up very soon. So I can take 2 more questions, but if you restrict yourself to 20 seconds, then we could get a response. Sorry, not 20 minutes. That's for later. But could I invite you to?
Hi, Doctor. This is Charmaine from CNBC. How do you see India-China relations evolving after the Arunachal Pradesh border dispute, especially since India has received support from the US? And what could be the economic implications given China's positive balance of payments with India? Thank you.
And the last question, please.
Yes. My question is, what's your take on the brain drain issue with increasing number of talented individuals like students and businessmen leaving India? How can we encourage them to stay? This is Kannan.
Can I have a roti kapra type question, if you don't mind?
Roti kapra type of question, the film or the
No,
issue?
so basically I think there are lots of profound questions here.
So yeah,
sorry,
10 seconds please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jashankar. My name is Shubha. So I'm a permanent resident here, and I think I see a lot of my friends are, kind of getting the citizenship, and it's great because they want the rate passport, because it gives a lot of access. That's the logic which has been put forward. So I say it is roti kapra because, I don't like to do that, but I just want to wonder, why is India so slow in terms of getting the passport much more acceptable in that sense? And the other one is that a few years back we banned a lot of the the apps, the Chinese apps in India. What have we achieved through that?
That's your roti kapra or theirs?
No. So that's a good one, but I just want to know what we achieved through that process. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
On Arunachal, this is not a new issue. China has laid claim, it has expanded its claim. The claims were ludicrous to begin with, they remain ludicrous today. And Arunachal is part of India because it is part of India, not because some other country says it is part of India. So I think we've been very clear, very consistent on this. And I think, that is something which will be part of the, the boundary discussions which are taking place. on the brain drain issue, look, I actually today am seeing something very different, which is a great interest in what are called mobility agreements. Mobility agreements, and it's very interesting when I look at the countries who are pushing it today. Many of them are historically very conservative about immigration. But technology today is creating demands, uneven demand supply situations in different parts of the world. So I think the idea that, as I say, drawing a line, this is inside and that is outside, and people go outside, we lose something. I think we need to get over it, because if one looks at it objectively, there are roughly 33 million, 33, 34 million Indians and people of Indian origin living abroad. Okay. If you had to ask me, net, are there a plus or a minus that they're abroad? I would say they contribute enormously and very differently. They contribute financially, they contribute in terms of ideas, in terms of being a build. Many of our key relationships have changed because actually Indians have built relationships abroad. I mean, if I look at Singapore, if I look at the United States, I look at the UK, I don't think our relationship would be the same if you minimize the diaspora factor. So I would urge you to look at it in a much more, I would say, contemporary way, much more linked today to what would be the collective requirements of a global economy, and how can India today actually benefit by tapping into an expansion of the global workplace is actually to India's benefit. It is not something which is to India's detriment. So that is something we need to look at. On the passports, we were talking about rankings. I know there's a ranking. This ranking is a bit awkward for me to question because Singapore, I think, is right on top. But I give you a very interesting ranking. Imagine if we made a ranking of passports saying conflict situations, people in trouble. Which of your governments will come and get you from there? What kind of ranking do you think you will end up with? So, rankings cannot be based on how many visas do you need. I mean, it's also a way of ranking. But I would say it doesn't cover many other aspects of what a passport is about. I mean, clearly a country with a very large population will have a different basis for a ranking than a country, which is much smaller, where the mobility requirements or the migration requirements are very, very different. My own sense today is that where the Indian passport is concerned, I definitely see, in a way I go back to a question which the young lady asked me before. I see a change in a way in India's branding, global branding. When I saw that maybe around the turn of the century, when this whole tech thing started, people started to look at associating Indians with tech. Today, I do think people associate, that sense of a kind of a rising India, things happening out there, very strong economy. I think all of this is featuring into a perception of Indians abroad. And finally, on the apps issue, as I said in my remarks itself, what do apps do? They generate data. Okay? So you have to ask yourself, how comfortable are you with your data being at which place? So depending on your level of comfort, you will agree with me or not. I can tell you I would be very uncomfortable with my info in some places. So I leave that to you.
On that note, I have to draw a close to this engaging session. So Minister, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and taking the questions.
Thank you once again, Minister and Dr. Iqbal, for such an engaging and interesting session. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated while Minister and these dignitaries take their leave. Minister is a very important engagement to attend to, so we really appreciate your understanding and patience. And let's put our hand together once more to thank Minister for such an interesting session. Thank you, sir. Thank you.